The entire restaurant froze when the millionaire's wife suddenly stood
Please
up,
lower your voice. I
her
assure
diamond
you we will
necklace
resolve this
glittering as she
issue
pointed
immediately.
furiously at the young waitress. No one dared to breathe. But the moment the waitress calmly caught her wrist without a single word, the tables turned. In a room built on wealth and pride, grace had just silenced power. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The morning light slid through the windows of Magnolia Table, painting long ribbons of gold across the polished counter. Outside, the streets of Savannah still held the hush of early autumn. You could almost hear the river breathe if you stood still enough. Inside, coffee percolated slow and steady the way it always had since the diner opened in 1957. Clara Donnelly wiped a circle on the counter until she could see her own reflection. 32 years old, a former research assistant turned waitress, she looked as though she still expected to wake up in another life, the one with notebooks and deadlines and bylines that mattered. But that world had folded up when the newspaper cut her department. Now her hands smelled of lemon soap and coffee grounds. Harold Green, the cook, leaned out from the pass window, his apron smudged with flour. "Morning sunshine," he called. His voice was the kind that could calm a thunderstorm. "You're early again." "Couldn't sleep, didn't try much," Clara said. She poured him a cup of the first brew. "Old habits." He chuckled. "Old habits or old worries?" She smiled faintly. "Both, maybe." At 7 sharp, the first customer of the day arrived, Margaret Langford, wife of the man whose name sat on half the buildings downtown. She came wrapped in navy silk and confidence so sharp it could cut glass. People said she never repeated a dress or an apology. Harold muttered, "Well," battened the hatches and disappeared into the kitchen. Margaret chose her usual booth, the one beneath the photo of the Savannah River at dusk. "Still water with lemon, paper thin slice," she said without looking up. Clara nodded, remembering the warning Harold had given her on her first day. Mind the lemon, mind the tone, and never mind arguing. As Clara placed the glass before her, Margaret's eyes flicked upward, blue cold measuring. "You're new. I started a few weeks ago, ma'am." "I see." A pause. "I prefer the glass chilled." "Yes, ma'am." Clara exchanged the drink, her movements careful, quiet. Around them, the diner filled with the smell of frying bacon and maple syrup, yet it felt colder than the morning air outside. Margaret had that effect, rooms bent around her until kindness had no place to stand. When Harold delivered a plate to the next booth, his sleeve brushed slightly against Margaret's napkin. "Excuse me?" She said 2 words that froze everyone mid-motion. "Yes, ma'am," Harold asked. "You've contaminated my space." She slid the plate aside with one manicured finger. "Please remove it." Harold's jaw tightened. Clara stepped forward. "I'll take care of it, ma'am." Margaret's gaze lingered. "You should. Cleanliness speaks of character." "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, voice steady though her chest trembled. When the woman finally turned back to her phone, Harold whispered, "Don't let her get to you, darling. She's been mean since the Eisenhower years." Clara forced a grin, but the words sank deep. Mean, yes, but there was something else beneath that ice, something practiced. By noon, the place hummed again. Tourists laughed over pecan pie. A boy dropped a nickel in the jukebox, and the old tune Moon River filled the room. For a moment, life felt ordinary. Clara carried a tray of refills when she noticed a little girl standing near the door. Red curls. Freckles, a paper crown from the bakery next door. "You lost sweetheart?" Clara asked. The child shook her head. "My grandpa's fixing the sign outside. He said I could wait here." "That's so. What's your name, Maddie?" "Well, Maddie, you can keep me company while you wait." The girl climbed onto a stool, leg swinging. "You work here every day most days. You look sad." Clara blinked. "Do I? Grandpa says sad people tell the best stories." Clara laughed softly. "Your grandpa sounds wise." "He's old," Maddie said matter-of-factly. "Old people know things." Harold came out from the kitchen with a plate of hush puppies and winked at Maddie. "For the princess in the paper crown," he said. Maddie giggled, her small hands breaking one open steam curling upward like tiny ghosts of the fryer. Clara couldn't help but smile. For the first time all morning, the diner felt warm again. Then the doorbell chimed and silence folded back over the room. Margaret Langford had returned, not for a forgotten purse or scarf, but with her husband, Edward. He looked tired, like a man who'd spent too many years walking on glass floors. They sat in the same booth, the one that caught every beam of afternoon sun. Clara watched them from the counter. Edward murmured something. Margaret answered without looking at him. Her hand never stopped moving phone fork napkin, as if stillness might reveal the truth she'd rather hide. When Clara brought their coffee, Margaret's eyes narrowed. "This cup has a mark." "I'm sorry, ma'am. Do you people not inspect what you serve?" she interrupted. The words carried just enough volume to draw every ear in the diner. Harold's ladle paused mid-air. Maddie turned in her seat. Even Edward looked up, his expression weary. Clara felt the weight of a dozen stares pressing against her ribs. She took a slow breath, placed the cup on the tray, and said gently, "I'll replace it right away." Margaret studied her, waiting for a flinch. When none came, the woman's lips twitched with annoyance. "Next time, remember, perfection isn't optional." "Yes, ma'am." Clara moved toward the coffee pot, her pulse steady now. Something about the cruelty no longer shocked her. It simply revealed itself for what it was, a habit of power. She remembered the days she'd chased stories of corruption and hypocrisy. For the paper, how often the truth hid behind polite smiles. The face before her was just another mask in a world full of them. As she turned back with a fresh cup, Maddie slid off her stool and whispered, "Don't worry. Grandpa says mean people are only loud because nobody listens to their quiet." Clara knelt beside her, touched by the child's certainty. "He's a very smart man. He's right outside," Maddie said proudly. "He fixes things." Clara smiled. "Maybe that's what I do too. I just haven't figured out how yet." The afternoon waned into gold. Edward paid the check with a nod that almost looked like gratitude. Margaret swept out ahead of him, leaving the faint scent of expensive perfume and something colder emptiness. When the door closed, Harold muttered, "Storm's past." Clara didn't answer. She was still watching the sunlight on the glass where Margaret's handprint lingered pale and perfect. Maddie's voice broke the hush. "You think she's happy?" Clara looked down at the child, then out through the window where the couple's car disappeared into the Spanish moss-lined street. "No," she said softly, "just practiced." Harold brought 2 cups of cocoa to the counter. "One for you, one for our guest," he winked. "You'll need it sugar. Folks like her don't stay gone for long." Clara wrapped her fingers around the warm mug. Outside, the late sun spilled over the cobblestones, gilding everything in quiet forgiveness. Somewhere beyond the square, church bells began to ring, slow, patient chimes that carried the promise of another chance. She didn't know it yet, but this was the morning that would change her life, the moment the timid waitress would become the woman who finally learned that standing tall didn't always mean standing loud. And when the last bell faded, Clara whispered to herself, "Some truths start small, like kindness served with coffee." Outside the old pickup, Harold Called Faithful rumbled to life. Maddie waved from the passenger seat, her paper crown catching the light as the truck pulled away. Clara watched until the sound vanished into the hum of evening traffic. Then she straightened her apron, looked around the quiet diner, and smiled to no one in particular. Because somehow she already knew the next time the powerful Mrs. Langford returned, Clara would be ready. A soft drizzle fell over Savannah the next morning, leaving the streets slick and glimmering beneath the lamplight. The magnolia table opened as always, the air inside rich with the scent of buttered toast and coffee. Clara arrived early, brushing rain from her sleeves. Harold was already behind the counter, stirring a pot of grits that bubbled like a lullaby. "Morning sugar," he greeted. "Rain's good for business. Folks want warmth when the sky looks lonely." Clara smiled faintly. "Then we'll serve comfort by the cup." They worked in rhythm, the kind born of quiet trust. Around 8, the bells above the door chimed, and Maddie trotted in, hair damp from the drizzle, her paper crown replaced by a yellow rain hat. Harold followed, carrying his toolbox. "Grandpa's fixing the sign again," she announced proudly. "Said it squeaks like a hungry raccoon." Harold laughed, handing her a rag to dry her shoes. "And you, Miss Clara, are officially promoted to chief babysitter." Maddie perched on her usual stool, watching Clara pour coffee for the early crowd. "Do you like your job?" she asked suddenly. Clara glanced at her. "Most days. What about the mean lady?" The question made Clara pause. "Mrs. Langford?" "Yeah. Grandpa says you can't fight mean with mean." Clara nodded slowly. "He's right, but sometimes kindness feels like letting people step on you." Maddie tilted her head. "Then maybe kindness should wear shoes." Clara laughed, surprised at the child's wisdom. "I'll remember that." Outside, the rain softened to a mist. Through the window, Clara saw Harold adjusting the diner's wooden sign, his figure steady against the gray. It reminded her of her own father years ago mending a broken fence while she read him her first article draft. "You keep writing, baby," he'd said. "Truth might walk slow, but it always gets home." Her throat tightened at the memory. She'd been chasing truth ever since, until the newspaper closed its doors and left her stranded between pride and rent money. "Why are you sad again?" Maddie asked, noticing her expression. "I was just remembering someone who taught me to fix things, like Grandpa," sort of Clara said softly. "But I wasn't as good a student as you." The door opened, letting in a breeze that carried perfume, sharp, expensive, unmistakable. Margaret Langford. Her entrance quieted every fork and spoon. She removed her gloves like a queen discarding rules. "Good morning," Clara said carefully. Margaret didn't answer right away. She scanned the room, her eyes catching on Maddie's bright rain hat. "I see this place still hosts children," Harold called from the kitchen. "She's family." "Charming," Margaret murmured, sliding into her booth. Clara approached with the menu. "Would you like your usual, ma'am?" "Still water, no ice. Lemon slice thinner than last time." "Yes, ma'am." As Clara turned to fetch it, Maddie whispered, "Why does she talk like she's allergic to happy?" Clara bit back a laugh. Some folks forget how to say it. When Clara returned, she noticed Edward Langford wasn't with his wife. Margaret sat alone, her posture rigid, her phone clutched like a lifeline. For a moment, Clara almost felt pity. Almost. Margaret looked up suddenly. "You're the researcher," she said. Clara froze. "Excuse me, I remember you now. I've seen your face a piece in the Savannah Journal, wasn't it? Investigative something? Yes, ma'am. A long time ago. Interesting career change." Margaret's smile was tight. One might almost call it a fall. The words landed like stones. Maddie, sensing the shift, frowned and whispered, "That lady needs a hug. Or a nap." Clara steadied her breath. "We all fall, ma'am," she said quietly. "It's how we stand back up that counts." For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, the kind that reveals more than sound ever could. Margaret's eyes flickered, not with anger, but something fleeting, almost human, before the mask returned. "I expect my soup hot this time," she said curtly. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, turning away before the tremor in her hands could show. The rest of the morning moved like a song played too softly to hear. Rain tapped on the window panes, turning the streets to silver ribbons. Inside Magnolia Table, every sound seemed louder. The scrape of forks, the hiss of coffee, the sighs that hid behind polite smiles. Margaret ate alone, her eyes darting to her phone again and again as if afraid of silence. Clara watched from the counter, pretending to polish silverware. She wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something deeper, a mix of curiosity and sadness. What made a person so brittle that kindness felt like a threat? Maddie finished her cocoa and leaned across the counter. "Miss Clara, you should tell her a story." Clara blinked. "A story Grandpa says stories help people remember who they are." Clara smiled gently. "Maybe she doesn't want to remember." "Then she needs 2 stories," Maddie said, determined. Before Clara could answer, the front door creaked again. A delivery man stepped inside, soaked from the rain. "Drop off for Mrs. Langford," he said, holding a thick envelope sealed with gold tape. Margaret took it with a nod and signed the slip. Her hands trembled slightly, though she hid it by adjusting her napkin. Curiosity tugged at Clara, but she forced herself back to the counter. It wasn't her business, not yet. Minutes later, Margaret called out, "Check, please." Clara brought the bill, trying to mask her unease. But as Margaret reached for her purse, the envelope slipped from her bag, landing open on the floor. A photograph slid halfway out, an old headshot of a blonde woman with bright makeup and the words, "Vicki Lowell, Model Agency 2002. Clara froze. The resemblance was unmistakable. The sharp cheekbones, the eyes, the practiced smile. It was Margaret, younger, rawer, unrefined. Clara's pulse quickened. She bent to hand the envelope back, pretending not to notice the photo, but Margaret's face had gone pale. Their eyes met. For a moment, all pretense dropped. Margaret snatched the envelope, her voice breaking the silence like glass. "Be careful what you think you've seen." Clara straightened slowly. "I only saw a photo, ma'am." "Then forget it," Margaret hissed. "Some things deserve to stay buried." She swept out of the diner, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and a chill that settled in the air long after she was gone. Harold came from the kitchen, wiping his hands. What was that about? Clara didn't answer. She was staring at the spot where the photo had fallen, heart-pounding. Nothing. Maybe something. Maddie tugged on her sleeve. She looked scared, the girl said softly. Even mean people get scared. Clara crouched beside her. You noticed that, huh? Maddie nodded. Grandpa says fear makes folks forget how to be nice. Clara smiled sadly. Your grandpa sounds like a preacher. He says kindness is cheaper than fixing broken signs. Clara ruffled the girl's curls. He's right again. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed and new. The smell of wet earth drifted through the open door. Clara stepped to the window, watching Margaret's car vanish down the street. She didn't know why, but something inside her whispered that the woman's story wasn't over, and neither was hers. Harold called out, You okay, sugar? Clara turned back, wiping her hands on her apron. Yeah, she said quietly. Just thinking about truth and how heavy it can be when you finally hold it. She walked to the counter, picking up the napkin Margaret had left behind. Beneath it lay a single folded note written in neat cursive. Be careful, Miss Donnelly. Curiosity is a dangerous habit. The words sent a small shiver through her, but beneath that chill, another feeling stirred resolve. She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Looks like the storm's just beginning, she murmured. Outside, thunder rolled far away over the Savannah River, and the bell above the diner's door jingled in the breeze. By the time Friday came, Savannah's streets glowed under the golden hush of early autumn evenings. Spanish moss swayed gently from the oak trees, and the air smelled of pecans and river salt. Magnolia Table was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that carried secrets. Clara arrived early again, carrying her father's old leather notebook, its corners soft from years of use. She had barely written since losing her job at the Savannah Journal, but now her fingers itched for the comfort of ink. Inside were only blank pages waiting. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window where she could see the courthouse dome gleam in the distance. The note from Margaret still rested in her apron pocket, creased and worn from her constant touch. Curiosity is a dangerous habit. The words should have been a warning. Instead, they felt like an invitation. Harold slid into the seat across from her, setting down a plate of biscuits. You've been thinking hard all week, sugar. Either you're fixing to write something or you're fixing to blow up the town. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe both. He chuckled. That bad, huh? I can't shake the feeling she's hiding something, Clara said, lowering her voice. That woman, Margaret Langford. I saw a photo she dropped, a modeling headshot but under another name, Vicki Lowell. She was terrified when I saw it. Harold raised a brow. People reinvent themselves all the time, darling. Some run from mistakes, some from shame. She runs from both, Clara said quietly. And I need to know why. Harold sighed, shaking his head. You're digging again, Clara. Remember what curiosity did to the cat? She smiled sadly. It made her live 9 lives. By afternoon, the diner filled with its usual rhythm, the clink of cups, the low hum of conversation. Maddie skipped in from school, her backpack bouncing. Miss Clara, look what I drew. She unfolded a crayon sketch of the diner, Harold by the stove, Clara behind the counter, and herself wearing her paper crown again. It's beautiful, Clara said, bending to admire it. That's you, Maddie said, proudly pointing at a figure with a big red heart drawn on the apron, because you fix sad faces. Clara felt her throat tighten. You've got quite an eye for truth, kiddo. Grandpa says artists see what hearts hide. Before Clara could answer, the bell above the door jingled and a man in a crisp gray suit stepped inside holding a briefcase. He scanned the room, then walked straight toward her. Excuse me, are you Miss Donnelly? Clara blinked. Yes, can I help you? He handed her a card. Thomas Clay, private investigator, Atlanta. I'm trying to reach Mrs. Margaret Langford. She listed this diner as a frequent stop. Harold's brow furrowed. What's she done now? The man hesitated. Nothing illegal, sir, but I'm working a background verification request. I was hoping to confirm whether she ever went by the name Vicki Lowell. The air seemed to thin. Clara exchanged a glance with Harold. What makes you think that cross-referencing a client's insurance record, Clay said, flipping through his folder. But when I reached her office, I was told she'd deny everything. Clara steadied her voice. I'm afraid I can't help you. I figured you'd say that. He tipped his hat politely. But if you change your mind, here's my number. After he left, Harold whistled low. Well, I'll be. That name you found wasn't just a coincidence. Clara exhaled slowly, gripping the card. No, it wasn't. Later that night, when the diner closed, she sat alone with her notebook open beneath the soft glow of the counter lamp. The streets outside were empty, rain whispering against the windows. She traced the name Vicki Lowell across the page and began to write not as a waitress, but as the journalist she'd once been. She started with questions. Who was Vicki Lowell? Why did she disappear? What made her become Margaret Langford? As the rain fell, her pen moved faster, her heartbeat steadying. She could feel her old self awakening the part that refused to be silent when truth hid in shadows. Outside, a car idled briefly before driving away, its headlights sweeping across the glass. Clara didn't notice, but Harold, watching from the kitchen doorway, did. Careful, sugar, he murmured to himself. You're stirring ghosts that ain't ready to sleep. Saturday morning brought a brittle chill that hinted of early winter. Savannah looked polished and quiet, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Clara walked to work beneath the Oaks, coffee in hand, thinking about the name written in her notebook, Vicki Lowell. The name felt alive now, whispering questions into every corner of her mind. Who was she before she became Margaret Langford? What had she done to bury her past so deep? When she reached Magnolia Table, Harold was already frying bacon, the smell filling the air with comfort. You're up early again, he said without looking up. What are you chasing this time, Clara? She set down her bag. The truth. I think Mrs. Langford's hiding something that could explain why she treats people the way she does. Harold turned the bacon with a sigh. Maybe she just likes control. Some folks mistake fear for power. Clara nodded. Maybe, but fear leaves footprints and I intend to follow them. Before the breakfast rush, she logged onto the old computer in the diner's office, an aging desktop Harold used for inventory. The screen flickered like a tired heart, but it was enough. She typed the name, Vicki Lowell. The search results loaded slow, line by line. Then she saw it. A grainy photograph from a defunct entertainment website, Vicki Lowell crowned runner-up in Miss Georgia Highway Pageant 2002. Below it, an old interview. Clara leaned closer, reading every word. I just want to be someone people look up to, Vicki had said, no matter what it takes. The picture showed a young woman smiling too wide, makeup cracked from heat, ambition burning through her eyes. Clara's stomach tightened. She could almost hear the desperation behind that smile, the same desperation she'd seen flicker across Margaret's face days earlier. She printed the article and tucked it into her notebook. Maddie peeked in, balancing a tray almost as big as herself. Miss Clara, Grandpa says you're hiding in the cave again. Clara laughed softly. I'm just reading Sweetheart, about the mean lady. Clara hesitated. About who she was before she got mean. Do you think she can get nice again? Clara smiled sadly. I think everyone can if they remember who they were. The bell over the door jingled. A man in a linen jacket walked in. Edward Langford. He looked older up close, the lines of weariness etched deep around his mouth. Miss Donnelly, he asked quietly. Yes, sir. I owe you an apology. My wife can be difficult, but she wasn't always this way. Clara gestured toward a booth. Would you like some coffee? He nodded, sitting heavily. There was a time she was full of life. Not the polished woman you see now. She used to laugh, used to dream about the simplest things. Somewhere along the road she buried that girl. Clara listened carefully, her mind racing. Did she ever talk about her past? Edward's eyes darkened. She called it her training, said she learned early that the world only respects the flawless. I tried to tell her she was already enough, but she built her armor and never took it off. Outside, a bus passed, splashing water against the curb. Clara poured him another cup, thinking of the photograph, the pageant, the hollow words. No matter what it takes. Edward glanced toward the window. She's in trouble, isn't she? Clara hesitated. I don't know, but sometimes trouble's the only way truth finds its way back. When he left, she returned to her notebook, the rain beginning again outside. The diner lights flickered briefly as thunder rolled across the river. Clara stared at the printed page until the letters blurred. In the reflection on the window, she saw her own face beside the photo of Vicki Lowell, two women bound by the same restless search for meaning. One had lost herself to lies. The other was still trying to find herself through truth. Harold's voice broke the silence. You keep digging sugar, and you'll find something all right. Just make sure you're ready for what you dig up. Clara closed the notebook. I'm not sure I am, she said softly, but I think I'm already standing in it. She turned off the lamp, leaving the diner in half shadow. The rain outside whispered against the windows like a warning too late to hear. And just before she locked up for the night, she noticed a new envelope slid under the door, cream paper sealed with gold tape just like before. Inside was a single note written in the same perfect handwriting. You don't know who you're dealing with, Miss Donnelly. Stop before you remember too much. Clara stood in the quiet diner, the note trembling in her hand. Somewhere down the street, lightning flashed against the river. She whispered into the stillness. Then I guess I'm getting close. Sunday mornings in Savannah always felt slower, softer, as if the whole town paused to listen to the church bells before deciding how the day would begin. The Magnolia table opened later on Sundays, giving Clara time to breathe. She sat outside on the porch with her coffee, the air still cool and sweet from last night's rain. Across the street, families strolled toward St. Patrick's Cathedral dressed in their Sunday best. Mothers fixed little boys' collars. Fathers carried toddlers half asleep. Clara watched them, her heart tightening with an ache she didn't want to name. There was something about the sight of family, something she'd lost too young, maybe never truly found again. Harold's voice drifted from inside. You plan on staring all day, sugar. We've got biscuits to bake. Clara smiled and stepped in. You'd think biscuits were the only religion in this town. They're the only ones that pay the bills, Harold said, handing her an apron. By mid-morning, the diner was full again, the air buzzing with laughter and the clatter of plates. Maddie sat in her usual spot, swinging her legs and sipping cocoa. She looked at Clara with curious eyes. You look like you didn't sleep. I didn't, Clara admitted. Too many thoughts chasing each other around my head. Grandpa says thoughts are like bees. If you don't calm down, they sting. Clara chuckled. He's right again. Your grandpa's a philosopher. No? Maddie said proudly, he just listens. The words stuck with her. He just listens. All day, Clara found herself listening to the small sighs of old couples, the rustle of newspapers, the laughter of strangers. Everyone carried stories, most of them invisible. And maybe she thought that was what Margaret had forgotten, the power of silence, the kind that listens instead of commands. Near closing time, the bell jingled again. Margaret Langford stepped in alone. Her presence still drew the air taut, but something in her was different. Her makeup lighter, her hair tied back as if she'd grown tired of perfection. Afternoon. Mrs. Langford, Clara said softly. Your usual table. Margaret nodded. Yes, thank you. Clara brought her water-thin slice of lemon, no ice, and turned to go. But Margaret's voice stopped her. Sit. It wasn't an order, not exactly, more like a plea wrapped in habit. Clara hesitated, then slid into the booth across from her. The clatter of the diner faded, leaving only the hum of conversation around them. Margaret folded her hands neatly. You must think I'm cruel? She said, eyes on the condensation of her glass. Clara shook her head. I think you're human. Margaret's lips curved in something close to a smile. A convenient excuse. Not an excuse, Clara replied. An explanation, maybe. Silence stretched between them. Outside, a church bell chimed the late hour. Margaret finally said, The man who came here last week. Thomas Clay. Did he speak to you? Clara's breath caught. He asked questions. I didn't answer them. Good. Margaret's voice lowered. He works for someone who enjoys digging up ghosts. You should stay away from that. Clara studied her face. You mean your ghosts? Margaret looked up, eyes sharp. Everyone has them, but not everyone survives them being unearthed. Clara leaned forward, voice steady. Then maybe it's time to stop running. Margaret's hand trembled just slightly as she reached for her glass. You don't understand. Truth doesn't set you free, Miss Donnelly. It costs everything. For the first time, Clara saw real fear in her eyes. Not arrogance, not pride, but pure, aching fear. The kind that comes from remembering who you used to be and knowing you can never go back. Clara wanted to ask more, but Margaret stood suddenly. Tell Harold his biscuits are still the best thing in this town, she said, her tone almost kind. Then she placed a 20 on the table and left before Clara could speak. Harold appeared moments later, wiping his hands. She say something useful? Yes. Clara murmured. Staring at the door, she said, "Truth costs everything." He nodded slowly. "She's not wrong." When they closed for the night, Clara sat alone in the empty diner. She pulled out the second envelope, the warning note, and laid it beside her father's notebook. In the quiet, she whispered to herself, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe truth is the only thing worth paying for." Outside, the last church bell faded into the humid dusk. And just as she rose to leave, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "If you want to understand her, go to River Street, the old theater, tomorrow night. Come alone." The night air on River Street was thick with the smell of rain and salt. Clara's shoes clicked softly against the cobblestones as she approached the old theater, its marquee dark letters missing like teeth. A single light glowed inside. She hesitated at the door, then pushed it open. The lobby was dusty empty except for a woman standing near the stage, Margaret Langford. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Margaret said quietly. Her voice no longer carried its usual steel. "You asked me to," Clara replied. "Why here?" Margaret looked up at the cracked ceiling. "Because this is where Vicki Lowell died," the words echoed through the vast, hollow space. Clara stepped closer. I mean the girl I used to be," Margaret said, turning toward her. "This theater held the last pageant I ever entered. I was 19, desperate, broke. When I lost, I swore I'd never be weak again, so I killed Vicki, built someone stronger in her place." Clara's throat tightened. "And did it work?" For a while, Margaret whispered, until the mask started to crack. She pulled an old photograph from her purse, the same headshot Clara had seen. She tore it in half. "You wanted the truth. There it is. But be careful, Miss Donnelly, the more you chase truth, the lonelier it gets." Clara met her eyes. Maybe, but silence breaks people faster. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain began to fall outside, pattering softly against the roof. Margaret slipped the torn photo into Clara's hand. "Keep it. Maybe you'll write something worth saving." Then she walked away, her heels echoing until the door creaked shut behind her. Clara stood alone on the stage, the picture trembling between her fingers. Somewhere beyond the rain, the bells of St. Patrick's tolled midnight low, solemn, forgiving. She looked at the torn photo and whispered, "Then maybe it's time to bring Vicki back." The attic smelled of cedar and dust, a scent of things that had waited too long to be remembered. Clara pushed aside the old boxes, each marked with her father's handwriting, steady and neat, even after 20 years. Outside, the Savannah wind rattled the shutters, carrying the faint hum of a distant church bell. She'd been searching for hours. It wasn't just grief driving her, it was something sharper. Ever since Margaret Langford's confession about the missing man, Arthur Hale, the pieces had started to move. Her father's case notes had mentioned Hale in passing, a philanthropist gone missing under unclear circumstances. But now, as she brushed dust off a metal file box, she saw a folder labeled in faded ink, Hale, Langford, 2003. Her heart thudded. She pulled it open. Inside were photocopies of property deeds, a few letters typed on Langford Holdings' letterhead, and one personal note in her father's hand. "If anything happens to me, the truth is here. They'll bury it under money, but paper remembers." The edges of the page trembled in her hands. For the first time, the old rumors of his accidental death felt like what they were, an unfinished story. Her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Clara Donnelly. The voice was low, rough, unfamiliar. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name's Thomas Clay. I used to work for Langford Holdings." She froze. "Why are you calling me? I heard you've been asking about Hale. You need to stop. There are people watching." A pause. Then softer. "Meet me at the old pier tonight if you want to know why your father died." The line went dead. She stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's life, the ticking clock, the quiet dust, the letter that pulsed like a heartbeat. By dusk, she was standing at the pier. The tide was low, the planks slick with rain. Clay waited in the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "You came," he said. "You didn't leave me much of a choice." He studied her for a moment. "You're like him, my father." He nodded. "Michael Donnelly, the detective who didn't know when to quit." Clara crossed her arms. "You said you worked for Langford Holdings. Why should I trust you? I don't expect you to. I'm a private investigator now. Used to be on their payroll until I found out what I was really paid for." Lightning flashed behind him, painting the water silver. "I was hired to silence a woman, Margaret Langford. Clara's breath caught. You mean, yes, the same Margaret who's been helping you? He looked away. They told me she was blackmailing her husband. I didn't know the truth then. She wasn't the threat. She was the secret he needed buried. The wind howled through the broken boards. You were going to hurt her. I thought I was saving myself. Turns out I was helping a murderer. Clay turned toward her, his expression hollow. That's why I called you. I owe your father my life. He once pulled me out of a bad case, saved me from losing my badge. When I heard your name again, I couldn't stay quiet. The words sank in slowly. For the first time, Clay's voice didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like confession. What do you want from me? She asked. He handed her a small envelope damp from rain. Your father sent this to a journalist 20 years ago. It never reached him. I found it last month. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and fragile. To whoever still believes in truth, the Langford's empire was built on one man's death. His name was Arthur Hale. Find him, and you'll find me. Clara looked up, tears mixing with rain. He knew. Clay nodded. He always did. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the city hadn't woken yet. Clara sat on her porch with the envelope in her lap, staring at the words her father had written. They were calm, steady, almost peaceful, like he'd made peace with the danger before it came. The hum of savannah drifted in distant gulls, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional car over wet cobblestones. Margaret arrived unannounced, her car pulling up quietly at the curb. She stepped out wearing a gray coat, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses. I heard about the pier, she said. You shouldn't have gone alone. Clara managed a faint smile. You told me to stop trusting anyone. I figured that included you. Margaret sighed. You're right. I've spent my whole life warning people about men like my husband, and yet I married one. Clara hesitated. You mean Lawrence Langford? Margaret's gaze sharpened. You know the name now. I found it in my father's notes. Not Edward, not some alias. Lawrence. For the first time, Margaret didn't flinch. That's his real name. Edward was just for the press. Lawrence is the man he was when no one was watching. She sat down beside Clara on the porch step. When Arthur Hale disappeared, Lawrence told me it was handled that Hale had stolen from the company and fled the country. I wanted to believe him. I needed to. Clara said quietly. And when my father came to you, Margaret's voice broke. He told me he'd found proof. Hale was killed. He begged me to testify, but Lawrence was listening even then. The silence stretched. Do you think he killed my father too? Clara asked. Margaret looked at her eyes, wet but resolute. I think he made sure your father never got the chance to speak. The wind rustled through the magnolia trees. Somewhere down the street, a church bell began to ring. Clay appeared at the gate, his coat still damp from the night before. He held a thin folder. There's something you should both see. Inside were photographs, aerial shots of the old Langford estate dated 2 decades ago. Each image marked a different section of the garden with small annotations in her father's handwriting. Clara traced the ink. He marked where he thought Hale was buried. Clay nodded. And after your father died, that entire section was repaved. New foundation, new building permit under Langford Holdings. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. He buried them both, the man and the truth. Clara closed the folder gently. Then we dig. Clay hesitated. If you do this, there's no going back. She looked at him. There never was. He met her eyes and nodded once. A silent pact between 3 people bound by guilt and memory. Margaret whispered, the house is still mine. He kept it in my name for tax reasons. If we go tonight, no one will question why the lights are on. The air grew heavy again, thick with the promise of reckoning. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Clara packed her father's notebook and the letter. She caught her reflection in the window. Tired eyes. Steady hands, the ghost of a smile. For the first time, she saw herself not as the detective's daughter, but as the detective he'd meant her to become. And when she closed the door, the old house behind her felt less like a home and more like the prologue to something long overdue. The Langford estate sat on the edge of town, like a memory the world couldn't quite forget. Marble pillars, tall iron gates, and magnolia trees that whispered in the wind. That night, the gates were open for the first time in years. Clara, Margaret, and Thomas Clay drove through the long driveway in silence. The car headlights swept across the fountain where ivy had overtaken the stone angels. Clay's jaw was tight. Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap. This house was my cage, Margaret murmured. Lawrence used to say a woman needed walls to protect her reputation. He never mentioned how easily they could become bars. They parked behind the servants' quarters. Clay killed the engine. We don't have much time. The security patrol passes every hour. Clara opened her father's notebook, the one she'd carried since childhood. His handwriting led them like breadcrumbs, South Garden, beneath the old fountain, Arthur Hale. The fountain was cracked and half dry, the stone cherubs staring down like silent witnesses. Margaret knelt beside the base. He had this rebuilt the same week your father died, she whispered. Said it was for charity. Said everything he did was for charity. Clay unrolled the ground scanner he'd borrowed from an old friend in the sheriff's office. The device hummed, tracing invisible lines through the soil. After a moment, he looked up. There's something under there. Large cavity, depth about 4 feet. Clara's pulse quickened. You're sure? I'm sure, Clay said quietly. Whatever your father was chasing, it's here. They began to dig their flashlights, cutting through the mist. The earth was damp and heavy, the kind that clings to your boots and doesn't let go. Every shovelful sounded like thunder in the quiet night. When Margaret's shovel struck something solid, she froze. Clay knelt, brushing away dirt. A corner of what looked like decayed wood appeared. Then another. A box, waterlogged and old. Clara knelt beside him, her breath catching. It's a coffin. Clay nodded. A small one. Temporary. He pried open the edge gently, and inside lay the remains of a man-bones, still wrapped in the faint outline of a suit. A tarnished pocket watch glinted near his ribs. Margaret gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur Hale. Clara took a step back, her throat tight. She could almost hear her father's voice, Paper remembers. Clay stood, his face set in grim understanding. We call this in anonymously. If we do it right, it'll hit the press before Lawrence can bury it again. Margaret shook her head. No, he'll know it was me. He'll destroy what's left of me. Clara turned to her. Then let me do it. He's already taken everything from both of us. He doesn't get to take the truth. Margaret stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You sound just like your father. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Somewhere beyond the walls, thunder murmured. They reburied the box, lightly covering their tracks. Clay snapped several photos and tucked the memory card into an envelope marked Truth. As they walked back toward the car, Margaret stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on the upstairs window of the mansion. A figure stood there motionless, the silhouette of a man watching them. Clara followed her gaze. Lawrence, she whispered. Margaret's lips barely moved. He knows. The Langford estate sat on the edge of town, like a memory the world couldn't quite forget. Marble pillars, tall iron gates, and magnolia trees that whispered in the wind. That night the gates were open for the first time in years. Clara, Margaret, and Thomas Clay drove through the long driveway in silence. The car headlights swept across the fountain where ivy had overtaken the stone angels. Clay's jaw was tight. Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap. This house was my cage, Margaret murmured. Lawrence used to say a woman needed walls to protect her reputation. He never mentioned how easily they could become bars. They parked behind the servants' quarters. Clay killed the engine. We don't have much time. The security patrol passes every hour. Clara opened her father's notebook, the one she'd carried since childhood. His handwriting led them like breadcrumbs, South Garden, beneath the old fountain, Arthur Hale. The fountain was cracked and half dry, the stone cherubs staring down like silent witnesses. Margaret knelt beside the base. He had this rebuilt the same week your father died, she whispered. Said it was for charity. Said everything he did was for charity. Clay unrolled the ground scanner he'd borrowed from an old friend in the sheriff's office. The device hummed, tracing invisible lines through the soil. After a moment, he looked up. There's something under there. Large cavity, depth about 4 feet. Clara's pulse quickened. You're sure? I'm sure, Clay said quietly. Whatever your father was chasing, it's here. They began to dig their flashlights, cutting through the mist. The earth was damp and heavy, the kind that clings to your boots and doesn't let go. Every shovelful sounded like thunder in the quiet night. When Margaret's shovel struck something solid, she froze. Clay knelt, brushing away dirt. A corner of what looked like decayed wood appeared. Then another. A box, waterlogged and old. Clara knelt beside him, her breath catching. It's a coffin. Clay nodded. A small one. Temporary. He pried open the edge gently, and inside lay the remains of a man-bone still wrapped in the faint outline of a suit. A tarnished pocket watch glinted near his ribs. Margaret gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur Hale. Clara took a step back, her throat tight. She could almost hear her father's voice. Paper remembers. Clay stood his face set in grim understanding. We call this in anonymously. If we do it right, it'll hit the press before Lawrence can bury it again. Margaret shook her head. No, he'll know it was me. He'll destroy what's left of me. Clara turned to her. Then let me do it. He's already taken everything from both of us. He doesn't get to take the truth. Margaret stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You sound just like your father. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Somewhere beyond the walls, thunder murmured. They reburied the box, lightly covering their tracks. Clay snapped several photos and tucked the memory card into an envelope marked Truth. As they walked back toward the car, Margaret stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on the upstairs window of the mansion. A figure stood there motionless, the silhouette of a man watching them. Clara followed her gaze. Lawrence, she whispered. Margaret's lips barely moved. He knows. The Langford mansion loomed against the twilight sky, its marble walls glinting with the last orange traces of daylight. A dozen police cars lined the circular drive, their flashing lights scattering across the fountain that had once hidden a body. The world now knew what lay beneath the magnolias, and for the first time in years the great house felt smaller, as if the truth had stripped it bare. Inside, Lawrence Langford sat behind his mahogany desk, hands folded neatly on a stack of documents. His expression was calm, almost rehearsed, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. He had built his empire on charm and intimidation. Now both were crumbling. Across from him sat his wife Margaret. No pearls, no silk, just a gray coat and the quiet fury of a woman who had stopped being afraid. She met his gaze and saw something she hadn't seen in years: uncertainty. You've brought this on yourself, he said coldly. Do you have any idea what you've done? Margaret's voice didn't waver. I told the truth, he scoffed. Truth? You mean gossip and photographs? Do you really think anyone will believe you over me? From the corner, Clara stepped forward. They don't have to believe her, she said softly. They'll believe the evidence. Lawrence turned, surprise flickering across his face. You Michael Donnelly's daughter, Clara replied. You knew him, didn't you, the detective who got too close? For a moment Lawrence said nothing. Then a slow, cold smile spread across his face. Your father was reckless. He didn't understand how power works. Clara's voice steadied. He understood it perfectly. That's why you feared him. Margaret looked between them, the tension crackling like a live wire. Lawrence, stop pretending. They found Arthur Hale. They know you buried him here. He stood abruptly, slamming his fist on the desk. Enough. The echo filled the room like thunder. Do you think you can destroy me with a few bones and a widow's guilt? No, Clara said quietly. But your own words might. She opened her father's old recorder, the one Clay had found in the file room that morning. She pressed play. Langford thinks he's untouchable, her father's voice said, tinny but clear. But every man leaves a crack in his armor. Hale found his. If anything happens to me, it means he sealed that crack with blood. For the first time, Lawrence's mask broke. His face drained of color. That tape is inadmissible, he muttered. Margaret's tone was almost gentle. So is guilt. But it still ruins lives. A knock echoed from the hall. Detective Harris, gray-haired and steady, entered the room with two officers. Mr. Langford, he said formally, we have a warrant for your arrest. Lawrence didn't move. His eyes darted to Margaret, then to Clara. You think this changes anything? He hissed. The world loves men like me. It forgives us. Clara met his gaze calmly. Then maybe it's time the world learned not to. As the officers led him out, the storm outside finally broke. Rain streaked across the tall windows, erasing his reflection as he passed. Margaret sank into the chair he had vacated. For the first time in decades, she exhaled, really exhaled, as if years of silence left her lungs all at once. Clay entered quietly behind the detective's rein on his coat. It's done, he said. He's in custody. The press already knows. Clara nodded, her voice soft. My father's case is closed. Margaret looked up, her eyes tired but alive. No, dear, it's opened wide open. For the first time, the truth has a place to breathe. The three of them stood in the dim light of the study, surrounded by trophies of a man who believed himself immortal. The empire of fear had fallen not with violence, but with words, paper, and memory. The next morning, Savannah woke to headlines that spread like wildfire. Billionaire Lawrence Langford, arrested for 2003. Murder of business partner Arthur Hale. Underneath a smaller subhead read, "Anonymous tip traced to local diner owner Clara Donnelly." Clara stared at the newspaper on her counter. The smell of coffee filling the diner. Harold flipped pancakes as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. When the bell above the door chimed, she looked up to see Margaret standing there dressed in simple linen hair tied back. She looked older, freer. "Mind if I sit?" Margaret asked. Clara smiled faintly. "You don't have to ask." They sat by the window where sunlight filtered through the blinds. Margaret sipped her coffee, black and strong. "They froze his accounts," she said quietly. "The lawyers are circling. I suppose this is justice." Clara shook her head. "Justice isn't freezing someone's money. It's knowing the truth finally matters." Margaret studied her. "You sound like your father." "I think that's the first time anyone said that, like it's a good thing." They laughed softly, not with joy, but with relief. Outside, the morning moved on unbothered by the ruins of the rich. Clay entered, then holding a small envelope. "They cleared the fountain site," he said. "Forensics confirmed everything. It's official now." He placed the envelope on the table. Inside was the old pocket watch, polished, restored, gleaming with faint initials AH to ML. Margaret stared at it for a long time, her eyes glistening. "He gave that to me before he disappeared. Said I'd need luck." Clara gently closed her hand over Margaret's. "Maybe it finally found you." Clay looked at them both. "You two should get some rest. Reporters will be back by noon." Clara smiled. "Let them come. For once I have nothing to hide." He nodded, hesitated, then added softly, "Your father would be proud, Clara. You gave him back his name." When Clay left, Margaret stayed behind. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. "You know," Margaret said quietly, "I used to think truth was a punishment. Now I see it's the only way to breathe again." Clara smiled. "Then breathe." Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight spilled over the cobblestones and the sound of church bells echoed faintly across the river. That afternoon, Clara walked back to the Langford estate. The police tape fluttered in the wind, yellow against the green magnolia leaves. She stepped through carefully, the smell of wet earth rising around her. She paused by the fountain. The ground was bare now, the soil freshly turned. She knelt, resting her palm on the damp earth. "Dad," she whispered. "We did it." For a moment it felt as if the wind itself answered her soft approving, carrying away years of silence. She stood and looked up at the mansion, the house of glass finally cracked open, its secrets spilling into daylight. The sun caught the broken windows, scattering 1,000 small reflections across the garden. Each one shimmered like forgiveness. The week after Lawrence Langford's arrest felt like Savannah had exhaled. For the first time in years, the city's whispers carried something gentler, not fear, but relief. At Magnolia Table, Clara's diner was busier than ever. People came not just for the coffee or her cinnamon biscuits, but because they wanted to see the woman who had helped bring down one of the most powerful men in the state. She never saw herself that way. To her, she was still just a waitress who kept her father's notebook in the cash drawer. Every morning she'd unlock the door before sunrise, wipe the counter, and whisper a quiet good morning to her father's memory. The old photograph of Michael Donnelly still hung behind the register, a younger man with kind eyes and that same half-smile she'd inherited. One morning Margaret walked in. She looked different, softer, lighter. The shadows that had once clung to her seemed to have lifted. She wore no jewelry now, no mask of wealth. Just a simple linen blouse and a small cross around her neck. "I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome," Margaret said hesitantly. Clara smiled. "You don't need an invitation. Sit down." They shared coffee in silence for a while. Outside, a few tourists passed by with cameras, but inside the diner, the world moved slower. "They finalized the charges yesterday," Margaret said. "Lawrence will stand trial next month. The prosecutors have everything, the files, the recordings, the photos from that night." Clara nodded. "And you," Margaret's voice softened. "I told them everything I knew. It felt cleansing, like I could finally breathe." She looked out the window at the sunlight spilling across the cobblestones. "I used to believe I couldn't survive without him. Now I see I was barely surviving with him." Clara reached across the table, touching her hand. "You chose truth over comfort. That's survival in its truest form." Margaret smiled faintly. "I think your father would have liked you." "He already does?" Clara said quietly. For a moment they both looked at the sunlight drifting through the blinds. Two women bound by pain loss, and a truth that refused to stay buried. The air smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang deep and steady as if marking a new beginning. Later that afternoon, Clara drove out to the river. The sky stretched wide and pale above the water, the kind of quiet blue that only follows a storm. She parked near the old oak trees where she and her father used to walk when she was little. From the passenger seat, she took out the pocket watch Clay had returned Arthur Hale's gift to Margaret, now polished and gleaming. She turned it over in her palm, tracing the initials with her thumb. Time doesn't heal, her father used to say, but it teaches you how to carry what doesn't. She set the watch down beside a single magnolia bloom she'd picked on the way, then closed her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "I think I finally understand what you meant about truth. It doesn't set you free, it makes you worthy of freedom." When she opened her eyes again, the wind was stirring through the trees, warm and soft like a breath on her cheek. Back at the diner, the evening crowd had started to gather, regulars who joked about the same things every day, tourists drawn by curiosity, and a few quiet souls who just wanted a cup of peace. Clay sat at his usual corner booth reading the paper, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You're famous now," he teased as Clara refilled his coffee. She rolled her eyes. "Please, I'm still the girl who burns toast when she's distracted." He chuckled. "Then maybe fame suits you." As the last rays of sunlight poured through the windows, Clara looked around her diner. The laughter, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of conversation. For the first time in a long while, she felt the world was exactly as it should be. Margaret's voice echoed softly in her mind. "Truth isn't punishment. It's the only way to breathe again." She stepped outside for a moment, letting the evening air wrap around her. The river glimmered in the distance, and somewhere a child's laughter carried through the streets. She whispered to the fading sky, "We're all right now, Dad." The sun slipped beneath the horizon, leaving behind a warm, golden afterglow. And for Clara Donnelly, daughter of a man who died for truth, peace finally came not as a shout, but as a whisper. Sometimes when the storms finally pass and the morning light slips through the blinds, the quiet feels different. It's softer, clearer, like the air after a long confession. Clara Donnelly stood in that kind of morning, knowing that truth had done what years of silence could not. In the gentle hum of her small diner, surrounded by the laughter of neighbors and the smell of coffee, the past no longer haunted her. It guided her. Margaret Langford learned the same lesson in her own quiet way. For a woman who once lived in marble halls and gold-framed lies, peace came not from the walls she built, but from the courage to tear them down. And as for Clay, the man who once carried guilt like a shadow, he found redemption not in justice served by courts, but in the quiet act of keeping a promise to a man long gone. In a world where so many chase power, this story reminds us that real strength often looks like forgiveness, the kind that starts small, over a cup of coffee or a phone call made after too many years of silence. Like the porch light that never goes out at your grandmother's house, kindness can guide us home long after the road has grown dark. Maybe you've felt it too, that ache of unfinished words or the weight of something left unsaid. Maybe you've stood at the edge of your own Langford mansion, afraid to face what lies beneath. But if Clara's story teaches us anything, it's that light will always find the cracks. All we need is the courage to let it in. Love, forgiveness, and simple human decency will always outlast wealth or reputation. Redemption isn't a grand gesture. It's the small act of telling the truth when no one else will. Happiness, in the end, isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning to live gently with it. Because everyone deserves a place and someone to call home. And perhaps as we grow older, we come to see what the young so often miss, that love freely given can still rewrite an entire life. Like the steady hand passing mashed potatoes across a crowded Thanksgiving table, or the familiar voice that says, "Drive safe, honey," before you hang up. Those are the real miracles that hold this world together. So tonight, as the magnolia leaves rustle outside and the city quiets down, take a moment to think about your own story. Is there someone you need to forgive, a truth you need to tell? If this story touched your heart, press 1 and let us know. If it didn't, or if you think we could do better, press 0, because stories only matter when they help us listen to one another. And remember, even the smallest light, A kind word, a gentle act can still turn a stranger's night into morning.